Welcome back, my friend. If today has been long, heavy, or filled with too many thoughts, then this quiet moment is for you. Before our story begins, give yourself permission to stop carrying the day. You do not need to solve everything tonight. You do not need to answer every worry. For now, simply let the world slow down. Draw the curtains, turn off the bright lights, or let them fade into a softer glow. Rest your body into the bed, loosen your shoulders, unclench your hands, and let your breathing become gentle. Here, we explore the quiet side of history and science, told slowly, softly, and peacefully, so your mind can drift while your body begins to rest. If this is your first time here, please subscribe and join us for more calming stories made for sleep. Now, close your eyes if you wish, settle into the stillness, and let tonight's story carry you away. Tonight, we follow something quieter, not a battle, not a storm, but a disappearance. There have been ships in history that simply kept going until they didn't. No distress signal, no confirmed location, no final message that explained what happened, just a last known position. And then, when nothing. Before we look at what might have happened, we begin with something much simpler. A ship leaving port on a journey that was supposed to be ordinary, and the moment it stopped being one. A ship that left and never returned. There was a ship called the SS Waratah in July of 1909. It left the port of Durban on the eastern coast of South Africa and began its journey toward Australia. It was not an unusual voyage. Ships had traveled that route before. The ocean, though vast, was not unfamiliar. There were established paths, known currents, and enough experience to make the journey feel routine. The Waratah itself was considered modern for its time. Large, well-equipped, built for long-distance travel. It carried passengers, cargo, and a crew that had done this before. There was no sense of urgency, no indication that this voyage would be different. It was simply another departure. In the early days of the journey, everything followed expectation. There were no reports of mechanical issues, no unusual weather patterns recorded, no signs of distress. The ship moved forward as it was designed to do, steadily, predictably, without interruption. Communication, limited as it was in that era, did not suggest anything unusual. There was no final warning, no moment that stood out as the beginning of a problem. Only continuity. A ship moving across water that gave no reason to doubt its progress. And then, at some point, that continuity ended, not with an event, not with a signal, but with absence. The last confirmed sighting of the Waratah came from another ship that had crossed paths with it. There was nothing remarkable about the encounter. No visible damage, no sign of instability, just a ship moving along its route. After that, there were no more reports, no arrival at the next port, no confirmed sightings, no messages, only silence. At first, this did not immediately cause concern. Delays at sea were not uncommon. A ship could be slowed by weather, by currents, by decisions made along the way. It was reasonable to assume that the Waratah would appear eventually at another port at a later time, still moving forward. But time passed and the ship did not return. Days turned into weeks. weeks, expectations began to shift. What had been a delay became a question, and then, gradually, it became something else, a disappearance. Search efforts began. Ships were sent out to trace the expected route. Observers scanned the horizon for any sign of wreckage, any indication that something had happened. But the ocean, as it often does, remained unchanged. There were no large debris fields, no floating cargo that could be clearly identified, no visible trace of a ship that had once carried hundreds of people. The search expanded. More areas were covered, more time was spent, but each new effort returned the same result: nothing. This absence became the defining feature of the story, not what had happened, but what could not be found. Because in most maritime disasters, there is a moment that can be identified: a storm, a collision, a failure, something that marks the transition from normal operation to crisis. But with the Waratah, there was no such moment, no clear point where the story changed, only a continuation that was suddenly interrupted without explanation. And this is what makes cases like this difficult to understand, not because they are dramatic, but because they are not. There is no visible peak, no obvious turning point, just a gradual shift from presence to absence. Over time, the search efforts were reduced, not because the ship had been found, but because there was no longer a place to look. Without a confirmed final position, the area of uncertainty continued to expand, and as it expanded, the likelihood of discovery became smaller. The ocean does not preserve the surface. It does not hold objects in place for observation. It moves constantly. And in that movement, it separates what once belonged together. A ship can sink without leaving a lasting mark. Debris can disperse before it is ever seen. And once that happens, the connection between event and evidence begins to dissolve. With each passing day, the Waratah moved further from what could be known, not physically, but in terms of understanding. What remained was not a wreck site or a confirmed explanation. It was a space in which something had occurred without being recorded. Years passed, then decades. The ship was never recovered. No definitive trace was ever found. And so the Waratah became something else, not just a lost vessel, but a question without a complete answer. What happened in the time between its last sighting and its disappearance? Did it encounter weather that was not recorded? Did something fail within the ship itself? Did a sequence of small events combine into something irreversible? These possibilities exist, but without evidence, they remain possibilities, not conclusions. And that is what defines ships that are never found. Not the scale of what occurred, but the absence of confirmation. Because without confirmation, a story cannot fully close. It does not resolve. It remains open. Somewhere beneath the surface of the ocean, there may still be answers, but the ocean does not reveal them easily. It does not return what it takes in a form that can be clearly understood. And so the Waratah remains in that space between what is known and what is not. A ship that left port under ordinary conditions, a journey that began like many others, and a disappearance that did not require a dramatic event, only a moment in which everything continued as usual until it didn't, and the ocean, unchanged, carried on as if nothing had happened. More ships, the same silence. The Waratah was not the only ship to leave under normal conditions and never return. There were others, different years, different oceans, different crews, but the pattern remained the same. One such case was a vessel called the MV Joyita. In 1955, it departed from Samoa, carrying passengers and cargo across a relatively short route. This was not an open ocean crossing into unknown territory. It was a regional journey, familiar, repeated many times before. The kind of trip that does not require special attention. The Joyita never arrived. Unlike the Waratah, something was eventually found. Weeks later, the ship itself was discovered drifting, still afloat, still intact enough to remain above water, but empty. There were no passengers, no crew, no clear sign of what had happened on board. The cargo was partially disturbed. Equipment was missing, but not in a way that told a complete story. The ship had not sunk. It had not been destroyed. It had simply been abandoned. Why? There was no single answer. Some suggested mechanical failure. Others pointed to fear, to confusion, to a decision made under pressure. But even with the ship recovered, the most important part remained missing: the people. And without them, the final moments could not be reconstructed. Another case comes from a different time and a different scale. The USS Cyclops, a large naval cargo ship, disappeared in 1918. It was carrying manganese ore across the Atlantic. More than 300 people were on board. The ship sent no distress signal. There were no reports of severe weather along its route, no confirmed sightings after a certain point. And then, nothing. No wreckage was ever found, no debris field, no confirmed explanation. For a ship of that size, with that many people, the absence of evidence was difficult to accept, but it remained. The ocean did not provide an answer. There are also cases where ships were seen multiple times before they disappeared. The SS Baychimo is one of the most unusual examples. Trapped in Arctic ice in 1931, its crew eventually left the vessel, believing it would sink, but it did not. Over the following years, the ship was spotted drifting through the Arctic, unmanned, uncontrolled, still intact. It appeared and disappeared multiple times, as if it remained within reach of observation, but never long enough to be secured. And then, at some point, the sightings stopped. No final location was recorded. No confirmed wreck was found. The ship that had survived abandonment, ice, and time eventually vanished as well. There is a difference between a ship that sinks and a ship that disappears. When a ship sinks and is later found, the story continues. Investigators can examine the wreck. They can analyze damage. They can reconstruct what likely occurred. But when a ship disappears without trace, there is no continuation, only speculation. And speculation, no matter how detailed, does not resolve a story. What connects these cases is not the cause, because the causes are not always known. It is the absence of a final moment, the absence of confirmation, the absence of something that can be pointed to as the conclusion. Each ship began in a defined way, a departure, a route, a purpose, but each one ended in a place that cannot be clearly identified. And that creates a different kind of narrative, not one built on events, but on gaps. Because when something happens and leaves no trace, the mind attempts to fill it. It imagines storms that may not have existed, mechanical failures that cannot be proven, moments of panic, of confusion, of decision, but without evidence. These remain possibilities, not answers. And so these ships exist in a space between history and uncertainty. They are recorded, they are acknowledged, but they are not fully understood. Their stories do not conclude. They extend not forward into new information, but outward into questions. And in that extension, they become something else, not just events that occurred in the past, but reminders of a limitation that even with navigation, with communication, with experience, there are still places where something can happen without being seen. And once it is not seen, it becomes difficult to recover, not because it is hidden, but because it is no longer within reach of observation. The ocean does not conceal in the way we imagine. It does not actively hide. It simply does not preserve what we need to understand. And so these ships remain as they are, not destroyed in a visible way, not recorded in a complete way, but present in a different sense as journeys that began and then move beyond the point where we could follow them. And once that point is crossed, the story changes. It is no longer about what happened. It becomes about what cannot be known. Why nothing is left behind. When a ship disappears without leaving a trace, the question that follows is often the same. How is that even possible? Because on land, events leave evidence. A collision leaves damage. A fire leaves remains. A movement leaves marks. Even something small can be traced if enough attention is given. But the ocean does not behave in the same way. It does not hold things in place. It does not preserve the surface. It does not create a stable environment where evidence can remain visible long enough to be observed. Instead, it moves constantly in ways that are not always visible. From above, at the surface, the ocean appears continuous, a wide, unbroken field of water. No boundaries, no fixed reference points, nothing that allows a person to say, this is exactly where something happened. And that alone changes everything. Because when an event occurs in a place without fixed reference, the first step in understanding it becomes uncertain. A ship can sink in a matter of minutes, sometimes faster, not always because of a storm or a visible disaster, but because of something internal, a structural failure, a shift in cargo, a series of smaller problems that combine into a single, irreversible moment. Water enters, weight changes, balance is lost, and once that process begins, it does not always allow time for communication. A distress signal requires recognition. Recognition requires time, and time is not always available. If no signal is sent, then the last known position remains the last point of certainty. But that point is only an estimate, because ships move, currents move. Wind affects direction, and even a small variation can shift the actual position by a large distance over time. So when a search begins, it does not begin at a precise location. It begins within a range that expands the longer uncertainty continues. At the surface, any debris that remains does not stay together. Waves do not need to be large to separate objects. Even gentle movement can spread pieces apart. A floating object can drift in one direction. Another, just a short distance away, can move in a different one. Within hours, a single event can become multiple small traces. Within days, those traces can be spread across an area too large to search effectively, and many of them become difficult to see from above. The ocean does not offer detail. It reflects light. It creates patterns that shift with movement. A small object, even one that would be obvious on land, can disappear within that surface, not because it is gone, but because it is no longer distinguishable from everything around it. And this is only the surface. Below that surface, the situation becomes more complex. The ocean is not a flat space. It has depth, sometimes shallow, sometimes extending thousands of meters downward, and the terrain below is not smooth. There are ridges, valleys, trenches, areas where visibility is limited even with advanced equipment. If a ship sinks into that environment, its final position may not be accessible. Not immediately, not easily, and in some cases, not at all. Because searching the ocean floor is not like searching land. There are no clear path, no continuous visibility, no simple way to scan everything at once. Instead, it is a process of estimation, of narrowing possibilities, of moving slowly through an environment that does not reveal itself quickly. And this takes time, but time works against the search, because the longer something remains unfound, the more its context is lost. Currents continue to move. Sediment can settle. Structures can shift. And the connection between the event and its evidence becomes weaker. Eventually, what remains is no longer part of a clear sequence. It is simply an object in a vast environment, difficult to locate, difficult to interpret. And so, the absence of evidence is not unusual. It is expected, especially in cases where no signal was sent, no witnesses were present, and no immediate trace was left behind. This is why ships can disappear without leaving a clear explanation, not because something impossible occurred, but because the conditions did not allow the event to be recorded. Everything that might have explained it was either never captured or was quickly separated from its original context. And once that happens, reconstruction becomes uncertain. Possible scenarios can be suggested, but they cannot be confirmed. And without confirmation, a story cannot fully close. It remains open, not because it is mysterious in a dramatic sense, but because it is incomplete. There is a difference. Mystery suggests something hidden, something waiting to be discovered. But in many of these cases, nothing is hidden. There is simply not enough left to find. And that absence is what defines these stories. Not the event itself, but the lack of a trace that allows it to be understood. Because when something disappears in an environment, that does not preserve evidence. The story does not end with an answer. It ends with a boundary, a point beyond which we cannot go further. And beyond that point, the ocean continues, unchanged, unmarked, holding everything that has passed through it without keeping what we need to fully understand what happened. The point where we stop knowing. There is a moment in every disappearance at sea that is rarely noticed. Not when the ship is lost, not when the search begins, but later, much later. It is the moment when the search ends without an answer. At that point, something changes. Not in the ocean. The ocean remains the same, but in the story. Up until then, there is still movement. Ships are sent out. Aircraft pass overhead. Coordinates are calculated. There is activity. There is effort. There is a sense that something can still be found. But when the search stops, that sense disappears, and what remains is not a conclusion. It is a boundary, a line between what can be known and what cannot. Everything before that line belongs to history. It can be described, recorded, analyzed. Everything after that line becomes something else, not fiction, but not fully history either, because without confirmation, there is no final version, only possibilities. This is where ships like the SS Waratah and the USS Cyclops remain. Not just lost, but unresolved. Their stories do not end in a single moment. They extend into an area that cannot be clearly defined. And this creates a different kind of experience for those who study them, because most events allow for closure, even difficult ones, even destructive ones. There is usually a point where the sequence is complete, where cause and effect can be connected. But here, that connection is missing. The beginning is known, the middle is partially understood, the end is not, and the human mind is not comfortable with that. It prefers completion. It prefers a clear structure, a sequence that moves from start to finish. So when that structure is incomplete, something else happens. The mind begins to fill the gap. It imagines storms that may not have existed. It constructs scenarios based on limited information. It tries to rebuild what cannot be directly observed. And sometimes those reconstructions become more detailed than the actual evidence, not because they are accurate, but because they are needed, because an unfinished story creates tension, not dramatic tension, but something quieter, a sense that something is missing, and that sense does not fade easily. This is why disappearances at sea remain present long after they occur, not because they are frequent, but because they are incomplete. They do not resolve into a fixed form. They remain open, and in that openness, they continue to be revisited. But there is another aspect to this, something less obvious. The ocean itself does not recognize this boundary. It does not distinguish between what is known and what is not. It does not change when a ship disappears. It does not mark the place where something occurred. It simply continues. The same surface, the same movement, the same horizon. To the ocean, there is no difference between a place where something happened and a place where nothing did. And this contrast is important because it shows that the boundary is not in the environment. It is in us, in our ability to observe, to record, to understand. When that ability reaches its limit, the story stops, not because the event has ended, but because our access to it has. And beyond that point, the ocean continues to hold everything without distinction. A ship that has sunk, a current that has shifted, a movement that was never seen. All of it exists, but not in a way that can be easily recovered. And this is what defines the idea of a ship that is never found. Not that it no longer exists, but that it exists outside the range of what we can confirm. There is a difference, and that difference is where these stories remain, between presence and absence, between record and silence, between what began as a normal journey and what ended without a visible conclusion. If a ship is found, its story can be completed. If it is not, the story does not disappear. It simply stops at the point where we stop knowing, and beyond that point, there is no clear continuation, only the same ocean, unchanged, unmarked, and somewhere within it, the final moments that no one witnessed and no one can fully recover. And that is where these journeys remain, not lost in a dramatic sense, but resting just beyond the edge of understanding, where the search begins. Every disappearance at sea eventually leads to the same decision, to begin searching. At first, that decision feels simple. There is a last known position, a final report, a direction the ship was heading. These pieces of information create something that seems clear, a starting point, and from that point, the search expands outward. In cases like the SS Waratah or the USS Cyclops, this starting point was all that existed. There was no distress signal to refine the location, no witness to narrow the area, only an estimate. And that estimate is where the search begins. Ships are dispatched, aircraft in later years fly over the region. Observers scan the surface for anything that does not belong. At this stage, there is still structure, still confidence, because the search is guided by logic. If a ship was here at a certain time and moving at a certain speed, then it should be within a certain distance. From that point, that distance can be calculated, but the ocean does not follow those calculations precisely. Wind alters direction, currents shift position, and small deviations over time become large ones. So the search area is not a fixed circle. It is a space that grows. At first, the growth is manageable, a few nautical miles in each direction, then more. Search patterns are established, lines are drawn, zones are divided. Each section is scanned carefully. From above, the ocean appears open, clear, almost simple. But that appearance is misleading, because what is being searched for is not the ocean itself. It is something within it, and that something may no longer be visible. If debris exists, it may be scattered. If the ship has sunk, there may be nothing at the surface at all. So the search is not only about looking, it is about interpreting what is not immediately clear. A shadow on the water, a change in the surface pattern, a reflection that seems different. Each possibility is examined, then dismissed, because the ocean produces patterns that resemble objects, and objects that resemble patterns. Distinguishing between the two requires time, attention, and often repetition. The search continues day after day. At first, there is still expectation that something will be found, a fragment, a signal, a confirmation that defines what has already happened. But as time passes, that expectation changes, not abruptly, but gradually. Each completed search area that reveals nothing reduces the probability of finding something in the next. And so the search expands again, further from the original point, further from certainty. This expansion is not random. It is calculated. Models are used, estimates of drift, predictions of current movement, but each model relies on assumptions, and those assumptions are not always correct, because the ocean is not fully predictable. It responds to forces that change continuously: wind patterns, temperature differences, subsurface currents that are not visible from above. All of these influence where something might move, and even a small difference in one variable can lead to a large difference in outcome. So the search becomes a balance between precision and uncertainty, between what is known and what is assumed. At some point, the area becomes very large, too large to search completely. And at that point, the process begins to shift, not in method, but in expectation. Because when a search covers a wide area and still finds nothing, the absence itself becomes information. It suggests that what is being searched for may not be where it was expected, or that it may not be visible at all. And this realization marks a quiet turning point. The search continues, but it is no longer guided by the same level of certainty. It becomes broader, less focused, more dependent on probability than on direct evidence. And probability does not guarantee discovery. It only guides effort. The ships continue to move. The aircraft continue to pass overhead. Observers continue to look, but the ocean remains unchanged. No signal appears. No debris field forms. No clear sign emerges from the surface. And in that stillness, the search enters a different phase. Not one defined by finding, but one defined by continuing without finding. And that difference is subtle but important, because it changes what the search is. It is no longer a process moving toward an answer. It becomes a process moving through uncertainty. And as it continues, the distance between what is known and what can be discovered begins to grow, not suddenly, but steadily, until the search itself is no longer about recovering the event, but about reaching the limit of what can be found. And that limit is not marked by a clear line. It is reached gradually through time, through effort, through the repeated absence of evidence, until one day the search continues, but the expectation of finding something no longer leads it. And in that moment, the process has already begun to move towards something else. Not discovery, but acceptance of what may never be found. When the search begins to drift, at the beginning, a search has direction. There is a starting point, a last known position, a path that can be followed, even if only approximately. But over time, that direction begins to change, not because new information appears, but because no information appears. Each search pattern that returns nothing does not confirm where the ship is. It only suggests where it is not. And with each area that is ruled out, the remaining possibilities become less defined. The search does not stop, but it begins to drift. In cases like the USS Cyclops, this shift happens slowly. At first, the focus remained close to the expected route. Ships moved along the line the vessel was supposed to follow. Observers looked for signs that something had interrupted that path. But when nothing was found, the search extended outward, further north, further south, into areas that were not part of the original plan. Each extension was reasonable, each one based on possibility. But with every expansion, something else changed. The search became less precise, because the further it moved from the last confirmed position, the more it relied on assumptions. Perhaps the ship had altered course. Perhaps it had been pushed by currents. Perhaps something had happened that caused it to move in an unexpected direction. These possibilities were not wrong, but they were not confirmed. And without confirmation, they could not narrow the search, only expand it. At the same time, the environment continued to change. Currents shifted, Wind patterns moved. The surface of the ocean did not remain fixed. So even if debris had existed in the early hours after the disappearance, it would not remain in the same location. It would move, spread, disperse, and with each passing day, the connection between the event and its possible evidence became weaker. This creates a second layer of uncertainty. Not only is the location unclear, but the evidence itself may no longer be where it began. So the search is no longer just trying to find something. It is trying to find something that has already moved. And movement in the ocean is not linear. It does not follow a straight path. It shifts in response to forces that are not always visible. A floating object can change direction multiple times within a single day. A current near the surface may move one way. A current below may move another. And without precise tracking, those movements cannot be fully reconstructed. So the search must account for multiple paths, not one trajectory, but many. And with each additional possibility, the area of uncertainty grows. At some point, this area becomes too large to manage in a focused way. The search continues, but it is no longer concentrated. It becomes distributed. Resources are spread across wider regions. Effort is divided, and with division, intensity decreases. Each area receives less attention than before, not because it is less important, but because there are too many areas to cover. And so the search begins to resemble the environment it is in: wide, unbounded, difficult to define. At the same time, time continues to pass, and time does not improve the situation. It reduces clarity because memory fades. Initial observations become less precise. Small details that might have been important are no longer available. Reports are reviewed, reanalyzed, compared, but without new evidence. They do not lead to new conclusions. They only reinforce what is already known, which is very little. And so the search moves forward without gaining ground. It covers distance, but not understanding. This is the point where the process changes, not visibly, not officially, but in perception. Those involved in the search begin to recognize that the outcome is no longer certain, that finding something is no longer the most likely result. This recognition does not stop the search, but it alters how it is experienced. It becomes quieter, less driven by expectation, more defined by continuation. Ships still move, aircraft still fly, observers still watch, but the sense of moving toward a discovery begins to fade, and in its place, something else appears, a different kind of awareness that the ocean is not simply a space to be searched. It is a space that can exceed the limits of searching, and once that limit is approached, the process cannot continue. In the same way, it must either expand further or begin to slow, and expansion is not always possible because resources are not infinite. Time is not infinite, and attention cannot be sustained indefinitely without result. So the search continues, but it does so with a different weight, not the weight of urgency, but the weight of uncertainty. And within that uncertainty, the direction that once guided everything begins to dissolve until the search itself no longer moves toward a specific place. It moves within a space that has no clear center. And in that space, finding something becomes less likely with each passing moment, not because it is not there, but because the path to it is no longer visible. And when the path disappears, the search does not end immediately. It continues, but without direction in the way it once had. And that is the moment when the search begins to drift, not away from the answer, but away from the ability to reach it. When technology reaches its limits, at some point, searching the ocean is no longer done by sight alone. Ships and aircraft can cover distance. They can observe the surface. They can identify what is visible. But when nothing appears at the surface, the search must go deeper. This is where technology begins to play a larger role. Sonar systems are deployed, devices that send sound down into the water and listen for what returns. The principle is simple. Sound travels through water. It reflects off objects, and those reflections can be interpreted. In theory, this allows search teams to see below the surface, not with light, but with sound. And for many cases, this has been effective. Wrecks that were once lost have been located using these methods. But success depends on several conditions. The search area must be defined with some level of accuracy. The equipment must be able to reach the necessary depth, and the environment must allow for clear interpretation of the signals. When any of these conditions are not met, the process becomes more difficult. In cases like the MV Joyita, it took years before technology was able to locate the wreck, not because it was hidden, but because the search area was too large, and the ocean floor is not a smooth surface. It contains ridges, valleys, and formations that can resemble artificial structures. When sonar scans these areas, the result is not always clear. Shapes appear, patterns form, but interpreting those patterns requires time. And even then, certainty is not immediate. In other cases, like the disappearance of the USS Cyclops, the lack of a defined search area made even advanced methods difficult to apply, because sonar does not search everywhere at once. It scans a limited path, a strip of ocean floor at a time, and then another and another. Each pass covers a small portion of a much larger space. If the space is too large, the number of passes required becomes impractical. Even with modern equipment, this introduces a limitation that is not immediately obvious. Technology increases capability, but it does not eliminate uncertainty. It only shifts it. Instead of asking where something might be on the surface, the question becomes where to begin scanning below it. And that question still depends on estimation, on assumptions, on information that may already be incomplete. Submersibles and remotely operated vehicles can also be used. These machines descend into the depths. They capture images. They provide a closer look at specific locations, but they do not explore large areas quickly. They move slowly, deliberately, and they require a target, a place that has already been identified as worth investigating. Without that target, they cannot be used effectively. So again, the process returns to the same problem: where to look. Even satellite technology, which can observe large sections of the ocean, has limitations. It can detect changes in surface patterns. It can identify anomalies, but it cannot see through the ocean to the depths below. It cannot confirm what lies beneath the surface. And so, even with advanced tools, the search remains incomplete because each technology addresses one part of the problem, but no single system addresses all of it. Surface observation cannot see below. Sonar requires a defined area. Submersibles require a specific target, and satellites cannot penetrate the ocean itself. Together, these tools increase the chances of discovery, but they do not guarantee it. When they are applied to a case where the initial information is limited, their effectiveness is reduced, not because they fail, but because they are operating within constraints that cannot be removed. Time also plays a role. The longer the delay between the disappearance and the search, the more conditions change. Currents move objects, sediment settles, structures degrade, and what might have been visible shortly after the event may no longer be visible later. So even if the correct location is eventually identified, the evidence may not appear in a clear form. This does not mean that nothing is there, only that what is there may not be recognizable as part of a specific event, and without recognition, confirmation becomes difficult. This is why some ships are found decades later and others are never found at all, not because they are unreachable, but because the process of reaching them depends on a chain of conditions that must all align. And when one part of that chain is missing, the outcome changes. The search continues, but it moves within limits, and those limits are not always visible at the beginning. They emerge over time as each method is applied, as each possibility is explored, and as each attempt returns without a result. Eventually, it becomes clear that technology, while powerful, does not remove the uncertainty of the ocean. It only defines where that uncertainty begins, and beyond that point, the search cannot proceed in the same way. It continues, but not towards certainty, toward the edge of what can be discovered. And at that edge, even the most advanced tools must stop, not because they are insufficient, but because the environment they operate in does not allow complete understanding. And within that environment, some journeys remain just beyond reach, not lost entirely, but not found in a way that can fully explain what happened. And so, technology reaches its limit, not suddenly, but quietly, at the point where searching continues, but answers do not. The moment the search ends, there is a point in every search at sea that is not marked by a discovery. It is marked by a decision, not a sudden one, not announced in a dramatic way, but a quiet realization that continuing will not change the outcome. At first, this moment is difficult to identify because the search does not stop all at once. It slows. Ships return one at a time. Aircraft reduce their coverage. Resources are reassigned. The process that once moved with urgency begins to move with hesitation, not because the effort is no longer important, but because the likelihood of success has changed. In cases like the set USS Cyclops, this transition did not happen in a single day. It happened gradually. Each search area that revealed nothing added weight to the decision. Each expansion that failed to produce results reduced the number of remaining possibilities until the possibilities themselves became too broad to pursue effectively. At that point, continuing the search was no longer about finding something. It was about not yet stopping. And there is a difference, because searching implies direction, a path toward an answer. Continuing without direction is something else. It is movement without expectation, and expectation is what defines whether a search is still active in a meaningful way. Eventually, the decision is made, not always explicitly, not always at the same moment for everyone involved, but it is made. The search ends not because the ocean has been fully explored, but because it cannot be. This is the point where effort reaches its limit, not the limit of technology, not the limit of endurance, but the limit of what can be justified, because every search exists within constraints, time, resources, attention. These are not infinite, and when the probability of success falls below a certain point, continuing the search requires more than reason. It requires belief, and belief cannot sustain a process indefinitely. So the ships return, the aircraft land, the reports are written, and the disappearance is recorded, not as an event with a clear conclusion, but as something unresolved. The last known position remains a point on a map, defined not by what was found there, but by what was not. This point becomes the boundary. Everything before it is documented. Everything after it is uncertain. And that uncertainty does not change with time. It remains because without new information, there is no process that can reduce it. There is only acceptance, not immediate acceptance, but gradual. Over time, the search becomes memory, the effort becomes history, and the unanswered questions remain as they were, unanswered. In some cases, new searches are attempted years later with improved technology, with refined methods, but even then, the same limitation exists. Without a defined location, without a clear starting point, the process returns to the same uncertainty. And so, most of these searches are not resumed, not because interest disappears, but because the conditions have not changed enough to produce a different result. The ocean remains as it was, wide, unmarked, unresponsive. It does not indicate where something has happened. It does not reveal what has been lost. It simply continues, and within that continuation, the absence remains not visible, not measurable, but present, a space where something once existed and is no longer accessible. This is the final stage of a disappearance at sea, not the moment of loss, but the moment when the search ends without resolving it. Because once the search ends, the story changes. It is no longer about finding the ship. It becomes about understanding that it may never be found, and that understanding is not always clear. It does not arrive as a single thought. It forms slowly through time, through repetition, through the absence of new information, until eventually it becomes part of the story itself. Not an answer, but a condition that some journeys do not end with discovery. They end with the limit of what can be known, and beyond that limit, the ocean continues, as it always has, unchanged, unmarked, yet holding everything that has passed through it without returning what is needed to complete the story. And that is where these searches end, not in resolution, but in silence. What might have happened? After the search ends, the ocean does not provide answers, but the questions remain. And when questions remain without resolution, something else begins. Interpretation, not as certainty, not as conclusion, but as a way to approach what cannot be directly observed. Because even when a ship is never found, it does not disappear without cause. Something happened. The difficulty is not in accepting that. It is in understanding what that something was. There are possibilities, not infinite ones, but enough that none of them can be confirmed without evidence. Some of these possibilities are simple mechanical failure. A ship is a system. It depends on structure, balance, and the coordination of multiple components. If one part fails, the rest can compensate. But if several parts fail at the same time or in sequence, the system can lose stability. Water enters where it should not. Weight shifts, balance changes, and in certain conditions, this process can happen quickly, faster than communication, faster than response. If that occurs, a distress signal may never be sent, and without a signal, the disappearance appears sudden, complete. This is one possibility. Another is environmental. The ocean is not always calm, even when it appears so. On the surface, conditions can change. Storms form, waves increase, wind alters direction. But not all storms are recorded with precision, especially in earlier periods of maritime history. A ship may encounter conditions that are not fully documented, conditions that exceed what it was designed to withstand. And if that happens, the result may not be gradual. It may be immediate, a structural failure under pressure, a shift that cannot be corrected. And again, no signal, no time to explain what is happening. In other cases, the cause may not be external. It may come from within. Human decisions play a role in every journey. Navigation choices, course adjustments, responses to uncertainty. Most of the time, these decisions are effective. They keep the ship on course. They maintain safety. But under certain conditions, a decision may lead in a different direction, not intentionally, not with awareness of the outcome, but as part of a sequence that cannot be reversed. A change in course to avoid weather, a delay to manage a situation on board. Small adjustments, but over time, small adjustments can accumulate. They can move a ship away from its expected path into areas that are not monitored in the same way. And once outside those areas, the likelihood of being observed decreases. If something happens there, the absence of witnesses becomes part of the outcome. There are also cases where multiple factors combine, not one failure, not one decision, but a sequence of events that align, each one manageable on its own, but together creating a situation that cannot be corrected. A mechanical issue during unstable weather, a navigation adjustment made under pressure, a delay that places the ship in a different position than expected. Individually, none of these would be enough, but combined, they form a condition that leads to loss. And if that loss occurs quickly, there may be no record of it, only a final position, and then nothing. The mind attempts to organize these possibilities, to choose the most likely explanation, to build a sequence that feels complete. But without evidence, each explanation remains equal, possible, but not confirmed. This creates a different kind of uncertainty, not uncertainty about whether something happened, but uncertainty about which version of events is true. And that distinction is important because it defines the limit of understanding. We can describe what might have occurred, but we cannot identify what did occur. And so these possibilities exist together, not competing, but coexisting, each one filling part of the space left by the absence of evidence, but none of them filling it completely. This is where interpretation reaches its limit, because interpretation requires structure, a beginning, a middle, an end, and without an end, the structure remains incomplete, so the story cannot settle. It continues to move between possibilities, not resolving into a single form. And in that movement, the disappearance remains as it was, not explained, but not without meaning. Because even without certainty, these events reveal something, not about a single ship, but about the environment in which it moved, an environment where cause does not always lead to visible effect, where events can occur without being recorded, and where the absence of evidence does not mean the absence of cause, only the absence of confirmation. And within that absence, the story continues, not as a conclusion, but as a set of possibilities that remain just beyond what can be known. What we think we control. For as long as ships have crossed the ocean, there has been an assumption that movement across water can be controlled. Not completely, but enough to make a journey predictable. There are tools, navigation systems, maps, instruments that indicate direction, speed, and position. There is experience, knowledge, passed down from one voyage to another. And there is structure, routes that are followed, procedures that are repeated, decisions that are made within a framework that has worked before. Together, these create something that feels reliable, a sense that the ocean can be managed, not dominated, but understood well enough to move through it with confidence. And for the most part, this is true. Most journeys are completed without incident. Ships depart, they follow their route, they arrive. The system works, but the existence of ships that disappear without trace suggests something else. That control is not always as complete as it appears. There are limits. Some of those limits are visible. Weather, for example, can be observed. Storms can be tracked. Conditions can be anticipated. Even if they cannot be avoided entirely, they can be accounted for. But not all conditions are visible. Some exist below the surface, currents that do not follow simple patterns, temperature differences that affect density and movement, pressure variations that influence how water behaves. These factors do not appear on the surface, but they influence everything that moves within the ocean, and they do so continuously. A ship may be on course. Its instruments may indicate that everything is correct, but the environment around it is not static. It shifts, not dramatically, not in ways that are immediately noticeable, but enough to alter outcomes over time. A slight deviation in current, a gradual change in direction. These are small things, things. Individually, they do not seem important, but over distance, they accumulate. They move a ship away from its expected path, not suddenly, but steadily. And if something happens after that shift, the location of the event is no longer aligned with the original plan. This complicates everything that follows, because the search will begin based on what was expected, not what actually occurred. And the difference between those 2 points may be significant. There are also limitations in communication. Signals do not always travel as intended. They can be weakened, interrupted, lost, and in earlier periods, communication was not continuous. There were gaps, time between transmissions, moments when a ship was effectively unobserved. If something happened during one of those moments, there would be no immediate record, only the absence of the next message. Even in modern systems, communication is not absolute. It depends on equipment, on conditions, on timing. And when one part of that system fails, the chain is broken. Another factor is human perception, the ability to recognize a problem as it is forming. Not all problems appear suddenly. Some develop gradually. A system begins to behave differently. A reading changes slightly. A response takes longer than expected. These are not always recognized as critical because they do not match the pattern of a clear emergency, and so they are interpreted as manageable until they are not. And by that point, the time for response may be limited. This is not a failure of skill. It is a limitation of recognition. The difference between what is happening and what is understood to be happening, and in that gap, decisions are made. Decisions that are reasonable based on available information, but that may not align with the actual condition. This is another form of uncertainty, not in the environment, but in interpretation. And when environmental uncertainty and interpretive uncertainty combine, control becomes more limited, not completely lost, but reduced enough that the outcome can change. And when it changes in a way that does not allow for recovery, the result may not be recorded, only inferred. This is why some disappearances feel unexpected, because from the outside, everything appeared normal. The ship was on course. The weather was manageable. The systems were functioning. There was no clear reason to anticipate a problem, but that appearance does not include everything that is happening. It only includes what can be observed, and what can be observed is always a partial view. There are processes that occur outside of that view. Small changes, subtle shifts, conditions that do not present themselves until they reach a certain point. And when that point is reached, the transition can be rapid, from stable to unstable, from controlled to unmanageable, without a clear intermediate stage. And if that transition happens quickly enough, there may be no opportunity to communicate it, no signal, no warning, only a final moment that is not recorded. And then absence. This does not mean that control never exists. It means that control has limits that are not always visible. And when those limits are reached, the system that once provided structure no longer defines the outcome. The environment does, and the environment does not record what it does. It simply continues, and within that continuation, a ship can move from presence to absence, not because control was completely lost, but because it was not absolute to begin with. And that difference is where these stories begin to take form, not as failures, but as moments moments where what was believed to be control was not fully so. When everything still feels normal. One of the most difficult things to recognize at sea is not danger, it is the absence of it, or more precisely, the appearance of its absence, because not all situations that lead to loss begin with something obvious. There is not always a visible change, not always a moment where everything shifts in a clear and immediate way. Sometimes everything continues as it was. The ship remains stable. The course remains set. The instruments continue to function. From the outside, nothing suggests that something is wrong. And this is what makes certain moments difficult to interpret. Because human perception relies on contrast, we recognize change when it differs from what came before. A sudden storm, a loud impact, a system failure that produces an alert. These are clear signals. They create a boundary between normal and abnormal. But when a situation develops without that contrast, it does not immediately stand out. It blends. It exists within what appears to be normal. And within that space, interpretation becomes uncertain. A slight delay in response time, a reading that is slightly different, a movement that feels unusual but not incorrect. Each of these can be explained. Each of them can be adjusted for, and so they are. Because the system is still functioning, the ship is still moving, the journey is still continuing. There is no clear reason to interrupt that process. And this is where the difficulty begins, because the absence of a clear reason does not mean the absence of a problem. It only means that the problem has not yet reached a level that is easily recognized. In many systems, failure is gradual. It develops over time. Small changes accumulate individually. They are manageable. Together, they create a condition that is different from what it was before. But because the change is incremental, it is not perceived as a transition. It is perceived as continuation, and continuation is reassuring. It suggests stability, predictability, control. So the system continues to operate as if nothing significant has changed, even when something has. This is not a lack of awareness. It is a limitation of perception, the difference between what is happening and what is being recognized as happening. And in that difference, time passes. Time in which the condition develops. Time in which options may still exist, but are not yet seen as necessary. Because the situation does not appear to require them. This creates a specific kind of vulnerability, not sudden, not dramatic, but structural, a condition in which the system remains active but is no longer fully stable. And when that condition reaches a certain point, the transition from stable to unstable can occur quickly, not gradually, because the gradual phase has already happened unnoticed. What remains is the final shift, the moment when the system can no longer compensate. And when that moment arrives, it may not provide time for response, no time to reassess, no time to communicate, only a brief interval in which everything changes, and then absence from the outside. This appears sudden because the earlier phase was not visible. Only the result is a ship that was on course and then no longer is. No warning, no signal, But in reality, the process was not sudden. It was gradual. It simply occurred within a range that was not easily detected. This is why certain disappearances feel difficult to understand, because they do not follow the expected pattern of an event. They do not begin with a clear disruption. They begin with continuity, and within that continuity, something changes quietly without drawing attention to itself until the point where it can no longer remain unnoticed. And by then, the system has already moved beyond recovery. This does not mean that the situation was inevitable, only that it was not recognized in time. And recognition is what allows for response. Without it, response does not occur. And without response, the process continues to its conclusion, a conclusion that is not recorded, only inferred from the absence that follows. This is the nature of certain losses at sea, not events that begin with disruption, but events that begin with normal conditions and remain normal long enough that the transition to something else is not seen until it is already complete. And in that transition, the moment that could have been identified as the beginning is no longer available, only the end. And that end does not explain itself. It only indicates that something changed in a way that was not recognized when it mattered. And once that moment passes, the ocean continues unchanged, as if the difference between before and after never needed to be marked at all. The moment that is never seen. When we look back at a disappearance at sea, there is always a question that remains. When did it actually happen? Not the disappearance itself, not the moment when the ship was declared lost, but the moment when the situation could no longer be reversed. That moment exists in every case, but in many of these journeys, it is never seen, not recorded, not observed, only implied, because everything that comes before it appears normal. The ship is moving, the course is set, the systems are functioning. There is no clear indication that something has already begun to change, and everything that comes after it is absence, no signal, no report, only the knowledge that something has already happened. So the moment itself exists between two states, between what appears stable and what is already unstable, between what is still understood and what is no longer accessible. And because it exists between these states, it is difficult to identify, not because it is hidden, but because it does not present itself clearly. It is not a single event. It is a transition, a point at which the system can no longer return to its previous condition. But that point does not announce itself. It does not produce a signal strong enough to be recognized as final. Instead, it passes quietly within the continuation of normal activity, within the assumption that everything is still under control. And this is why it is rarely observed, because observation requires contrast, a difference between before and after. But when the change is gradual, that contrast is reduced. It becomes subtle, and subtle changes are not always interpreted correctly. They are adjusted for, explained, placed within the range of what is considered normal until they are no longer within that range. And by that point, the transition has already occurred. From the outside, this creates a specific kind of uncertainty. Because the disappearance appears sudden, there is a last known position, a final report, and then nothing. So it seems as if the change happened instantly, but in reality, the process was already underway. It simply did not reach visibility until it was complete. This difference between appearance and process is important because it defines how these events are understood, not as gradual developments, but as sudden losses, and that interpretation influences how they are remembered as mysteries, as unexplained events, when in many cases they may not be mysterious in their cause, only in their visibility, because the cause exists within a sequence that was not fully observed, and without full observation, the sequence cannot be reconstructed, only approximated. This creates a boundary within the story, a point where explanation becomes interpretation, and interpretation cannot replace evidence. So the moment that defines everything remains not hidden, but unrecorded. And because it is unrecorded, it cannot be directly accessed. It can only be approached through possibility, through the combination of known factors, mechanical conditions, environmental influences, human decisions, each one contributing to a process that leads to that moment, but none of them identifying it precisely. And without precision, the moment itself remains undefined. This is where the limit of understanding is reached, not at the point of disappearance, but at the point of transition, where something changed in a way that could not be fully observed while it was happening. And once it has passed, it cannot be revisited, because the conditions that allowed it to exist no longer remain. Only the outcome does. A ship that is no longer present, a journey that no longer continues, and a space between those two states that cannot be fully described. This is what defines the final stage of understanding. In these cases, not the identification of a cause, but the recognition that the defining moment cannot be seen. And when that moment cannot be seen, the story changes. It is no longer about what happened. It becomes about what cannot be observed within what happened. And that shift moves the story into a different space, not one defined by events, but by experience, by what it feels like to move through a situation where the boundary between stability and instability is not clearly marked, where continuation does not guarantee safety, where the absence of change does not mean the absence of risk. And that is where the next part begins, not with the ship, but with the people who were on it. Because beyond the moment that is never seen, there is another question. What was it like to be there when everything still felt normal, even as it was already changing? Inside the moment that still feels normal. From the outside, a disappearance at sea is defined by absence. From the inside, it is defined by continuity, because for those on the ship, there is no moment where the journey suddenly becomes something else. There is only what is happening right now. The ship moves, the structure holds, the sounds are familiar. Water against the hull, wind across the deck, the low, steady rhythm of engines or movement through waves. These are not signals of danger. They are the background of every journey. And because they are constant, they do not attract attention. They create a sense of normality, a condition in which nothing requires immediate concern. People move through their routines. Tasks are completed. Systems are checked. Small adjustments are made, not because something is wrong, but because this is what is always done. Even in uncertain conditions, routine continues because routine is a way of maintaining structure. It provides a sense of control, a sequence of actions that can be followed even when the environment is unpredictable. So the presence of routine does not indicate that everything is safe. It only indicates that everything still feels manageable. And that feeling is important because it shapes how the situation is interpreted. If something changes slightly, it is measured against that feeling. Is it still manageable? If the answer is yes, then the process continues. This is how small changes remain within the range of normal. A delay in response time, a sound that is slightly different, a movement that requires a minor correction. Each of these is noticed, but not all are treated as significant because they do not immediately disrupt the overall structure. The ship still moves. The systems still respond. So the conclusion is that the situation is still under control. This is not a mistake. It is a reasonable interpretation based on available information, because the alternative would require acting as if something critical is happening without clear evidence. And that is not how decisions are made. In most situations, decisions rely on recognition, on identifying a condition as requiring a different response. But recognition depends on clarity, and clarity is not always present. So the process continues. Time passes, and within that time, conditions may change, not in a way that is immediately visible, but in a way that gradually alters how the system behaves. The ship may respond slightly differently to the same input. Corrections may need to be made more often. Attention may increase, but still, there is no clear signal that something has crossed a boundary, so the interpretation remains the same. This is still a normal situation, even if it is a more demanding one. This creates a narrow space, a space in which the system is no longer fully stable, but is still functioning. And within that space, time continues to move, not quickly, but steadily. And with each passing moment, the system moves further from its original condition without fully recognizing that it has done so. This is not a sudden transition. It is a shift, a movement from one state to another, but without a clear line between them. And because there is no line, there is no moment that can be identified as the point of change. Only a realization that may come later, if it comes at all, from the inside. This experience is not dramatic. It is not defined by fear, not at first. It is defined by attention, a growing awareness that something requires focus. But focus is not the same as alarm. It does not interrupt the process. It only adjusts it. And so the system continues until the point where it cannot. And that point, as described before, may not provide time for response. So the experience remains within that narrow space between normal and unstable, between control and loss of control, without fully entering either state in a way that can be clearly identified. This is what it means to be inside a situation that is changing without being recognized as such. It is not confusion. It is not panic. It is continuity under shifting conditions, and that continuity is what makes the final transition so difficult to see. Because when everything still feels normal, there is no clear reason to assume that it is not. And by the time that reason appears, the system may already be beyond the point where it can respond. So the experience does not end with a clear moment of realization. It ends with a transition that was not fully observed while it was happening, and from the outside that appears a sudden absence. But from the inside, it was something else, a continuation that slowly changed until it no longer could continue at all. The feeling that something is different. At some point within a situation that still appears normal, there is a shift, not a clear one, not something that can be easily described, but something that is felt, a difference between what is expected and what is happening. It does not arrive as a warning. There is no alarm, no signal that demands immediate attention. Instead, it appears as a subtle change, a delay that is slightly longer than before, a response that requires a second attempt, a sound that does not fully match what has been heard on previous journeys. None of these are enough on their own. Each one can be explained. Each one can be adjusted for, and so they are. Because the system is still functioning, the ship is still moving, there is no reason to stop. But the accumulation of these small differences creates something else, a feeling not of danger, but of uncertainty. And uncertainty is more difficult to interpret than danger, because danger has definition. It can be identified, named. Uncertainty does not. It exists without clear boundaries. So the response to uncertainty is not immediate. It is measured. More attention is given to certain details. Checks are repeated. Observations are compared with expectations, not to confirm that something is wrong, but to determine if something might be. This is a different state from routine. Routine requires little interpretation. It follows what is already known. Uncertainty requires evaluation. It asks whether what is happening fits within what has been experienced before. And when the answer is not entirely clear, the process continues without resolution. This creates a gradual shift in awareness. Not everyone experiences it in the same way. Some may notice small changes earlier. Others may interpret them as normal variation. Both responses are valid because the information available does not yet support a single conclusion. So the situation remains open, neither clearly safe nor clearly unsafe. And within that openness, decisions continue to be made, not as reactions, but as adjustments, course corrections, system checks, small actions designed to maintain stability, and for a time they may work. The system responds. The ship continues to move forward. And this reinforces the idea that the situation is still under control, but the feeling does not disappear. It remains, not growing dramatically, but not fading either. It stays at the edge of awareness, a quiet indication that something is not fully aligned. This is where interpretation becomes most difficult, because there is no clear signal to confirm what is being felt, only the feeling itself. And feelings are not always trusted in systems that rely on measurement and verification. So they are considered, but not acted upon as definitive. This creates a delay, not in time, but in recognition. The difference difference between sensing and knowing, and within that difference, conditions continue to develop. The system may become more difficult to manage. Adjustments may be required more frequently. Attention may increase further, but still, there is no clear moment that defines the situation as critical. So the process continues because continuation is still possible. And as long as continuation is possible, it suggests that stability has not yet been lost. This is the key assumption, that as long as the system responds, Ibriambend Kulf Ondet Sieve response, it can be maintained, but response is not the same as stability. It is only a sign that the system has not yet failed, and this distinction is not always clear in the moment because both states look similar. A system that is stable and a system that is compensating for instability, they produce the same outward result: movement, function, continuation. So the difference remains hidden until the point where compensation is no longer possible. And that point, as before, may arrive without warning. So the experience remains within that space between routine and recognition, between certainty and doubt. And within that space, time continues to move, not quickly, but enough to allow the situation to change further until the feeling that something is different is no longer subtle. But by then, the conditions that created it may already be complete, and the opportunity to respond may have passed. So what remains is not a clear moment of realization, but a sequence in which realization arrives at the same time as consequence. And from the outside, that sequence cannot be seen, only the absence that follows. But from the inside, it began with something much smaller, not a signal, not a failure, just a feeling that something was no longer exactly as it had been before. The response that still feels enough. When something begins to feel different, the first response is not alarm, it is adjustment, because the system is still functioning. The ship is still moving. There is no clear reason to abandon what is already working. So instead of stopping, the process changes, not in direction, but in attention. More focus is placed on specific elements. Systems are checked more frequently. Readings are observed more closely. Small corrections are made as needed. These actions are not unusual. They are part of normal operation, even in stable conditions. Adjustments are constant. No journey is perfectly fixed. There are always variations. Wind shifts, currents change, load distribution moves slightly over time. So responding to small differences is expected. And because it is expected, it does not indicate that something is wrong. It only indicates that something requires attention. This is an important distinction. Attention is not the same as urgency. It does not interrupt the system, it refines it. So the response remains within the existing structure. No new procedures are introduced. No drastic decisions are made. Everything continues as before, just with greater awareness. And for a time, this is enough. The system responds. The ship continues to move forward. Adjustments produce results, and those results reinforce the belief that the situation is manageable because each correction appears to work. Each change restores balance, at least temporarily. This creates a feedback loop. Action leads to improvement. improvement confirms that action was appropriate, and so the same approach is used again because it has worked before. But there is something within this process that is not immediately visible. The difference between correcting a condition and compensating for a condition that is still developing. When a system is stable, adjustments return it to its original state. When a system is unstable, adjustments maintain function but do not restore the original state. And that difference is not always clear in the moment because the outward result is the same. The ship continues, so the response continues. In the same way, adjust, observe, correct, and for a time, this cycle holds, but the effort required to maintain it begins to increase. Adjustments become more frequent. Attention becomes more focused. Small changes require more input to achieve the same result. This is a subtle shift, not dramatic, but noticeable. The system is still working, but it is working harder. And when a system requires more effort to maintain the same outcome, it suggests that something has changed. But again, this does not immediately create urgency because the system has not failed. It is still responding. So the interpretation remains the same. Continue, adjust further if needed, maintain control. This is a logical response because abandoning control without clear evidence of failure would be premature. So the process continues, and within that continuation, time passes. The condition continues to develop, and the system continues to respond until the difference between maintaining and restoring becomes significant. At this point, adjustments no longer return the system to its previous state. They only prevent further decline, and even that becomes more difficult. The response remains the same, but the effectiveness begins to decrease. This is the point where awareness begins to shift, not fully, but enough to suggest that the situation may not remain within normal limits. Still, there is no clear boundary, no single moment that defines the change, only a growing recognition that something is not resolving, and yet the system continues because it has not completely failed. This creates a narrow window, a space where action is still possible, but the nature of that action has not yet changed. It remains within the framework of adjustment, not transition, and within that space, the final shift approaches, not announced, not clearly defined, but present, because when a system is maintained beyond its stable condition, there is a point where maintenance is no longer sufficient. And when that point is reached, the transition from control to loss of control does not occur gradually. It occurs all at once. But from the inside, that moment is not always recognized in advance, because everything before it has suggested that the system can still be managed, and so the response continues right up to the moment when it no longer can. And from the outside, that appears as sudden absence, but from the inside, it was something else, a sequence of responses that always felt just enough until they weren't. The point where response is no longer possible. There is a final stage in any system that has been adjusting for too long. It is not marked by a single failure. It is marked by the moment when response no longer produces change. Up to that point, everything that has happened has followed a pattern. Something shifts. A response is made. The system stabilizes, even if only temporarily. This pattern holds, and as long as it holds, response. There is a reason to continue because continuation has been working. But eventually, that pattern changes, not gradually, but in a way that becomes clear only after it happens. A response is made. This time, the result is not the same. The system does not return to its previous condition. It does not stabilize in the way it has before. It continues to move, but without the same level of control. This is the moment where something fundamental has shifted, not in appearance, but in function, because from the outside, the system may still seem active. The ship may still be moving, but movement is no longer a sign of stability. It is only a sign that the process has not yet fully stopped. And this difference is difficult to recognize in real time because movement has always been associated with control. If the ship is moving, then it is functioning. If it is functioning, then it can be managed. But at this stage, that assumption is no longer valid. The system has passed a threshold, not a visible one, but a structural one, a point at which the underlying condition can no longer be corrected. And once that point is reached, the nature of response changes completely. Before, response was effective. Now, we aren't to see. Response is only reactive. It does not restore. It only follows what is already happening. This creates a different experience, one in which actions are still taken, but their outcome is no longer within control. The system continues to change, but not in response to those actions. It changes according to conditions that are no longer being influenced. This is the moment where control is no longer present, not because it was abandoned, but because it is no longer possible. And this transition does not provide a clear signal. There is no announcement, no moment that can be identified as the exact point where everything changed. Only a realization that may come too late, that what is happening cannot be reversed. And once that realization occurs, the situation is no longer about correction. It is about duration. How long the system can continue in its current state. How long movement can be maintained. How long structure can hold. But duration is not control. It is simply the time remaining before the process completes. And during that time, there is little that can be done to alter the outcome because the conditions that define the outcome are no longer within reach. This is the final stage of the internal experience. Not panic, not confusion, but limitation. The recognition that response no longer changes what is happening. And once that recognition is reached, the process moves forward without intervention. From the outside, this entire sequence is not visible. There is no record of the gradual adjustments, no record of the increasing effort, no record of the moment when response stopped being effective. Only the result. A ship that is no longer present, a journey that does not continue, and an absence that appears sudden, but from the inside, it was not sudden. It was a progression, a sequence of responses that became less effective over time until they reached a point where they no longer produced change. And beyond that point, the system continued, but without direction, without correction, without control, until it no longer continued at all. And then, on there was nothing to record, nothing to transmit, nothing to return, only the ocean, unchanged, as it always is, and somewhere within it, the final stage of a process that no one outside the ship ever saw. A process that did not begin with a single event, but ended with a moment where response absence was no longer possible, and that is where these journeys disappear, not in an instant, but at the point where continuation can no longer be maintained. And beyond that point, the story changes, because what remains is not the experience, but the absence that follows it. And that absence is what the world comes to know, not the sequence, not the moment, only the result. A ship that is no longer there, and a journey that cannot be completed. And that is where part 5 begins. Not with what happened, but with what remains after it. What remains after everything is gone. After a ship disappears, the ocean remains. It does not change to reflect what has happened. There is no visible difference between a place where something was lost and a place where nothing occurred at all. The surface continues to move. Waves form. Wind passes. The horizon stays the same. From a distance, there is no indication that anything has been interrupted. This is what makes the aftermath, the authmore of these events, difficult to understand, because when something ends on land, there is evidence. Structures remain. Marks are left behind. Even absence can be measured, but at sea, absence does not take form. It does not appear as something visible. It exists only as a lack of presence. A ship that was expected to arrive does not. A signal that should have been received is not. And this lack becomes the only indication that something has changed. But lack is not a clear condition. It does not explain itself. It only suggests that something is missing. So what remains after everything is gone is not a scene. It is a question that does not point to a single answer, but to a space where an answer should exist. This space is defined not by what is there, but by what is not. And because it is defined by absence, it cannot be directly observed. It can only be approached through expectation, through the knowledge that something should have continued, but did not. Over time, this absence becomes part of a larger structure. Records are updated. The ship is listed as missing. The journey is marked as incomplete. Dates are assigned. Locations are estimated. But none of these fill the absence. They organize it. They give it shape within a system that requires structure, but they do not resolve it, because resolution requires confirmation, and confirmation is what is missing. So the absence remains, not expanding, not changing, but not closing either. It becomes fixed in a different way, not as an event that has been completed, but as one that has reached the limit of what can be known. And beyond that limit, there is no continuation, only the ocean. And the ocean does not respond to questions. It does not return what is lost. It does not indicate where something may still exist. It simply holds everything within it, without distinction, without priority, without recognition of what matters to those outside of it. This creates a separation between the event and its meaning. The event has occurred, but its meaning cannot be fully accessed, because meaning depends on understanding, and understanding depends on information. Without information, meaning becomes incomplete, not absent, but unresolved. And so, what remains after everything is gone is not emptiness. It is something less defined, a presence that cannot be observed, a question that cannot be answered, a boundary that cannot be crossed. And within that boundary, the story continues in a different way, not through new events, but through memory, through the awareness that something once existed no longer does, in a form that can be recovered. This awareness does not fade quickly because it is not tied to a single moment. It is tied to a lack of closure, and lack of closure extends. It remains in the background, not always present, but not gone either. And this is what defines the final stage of these journeys, not their ending, but their continuation in absence, a form that does not move, does not change, but does not disappear. And in that form, the journey remains, not as a path that can be followed, but as a space that cannot be entered. And beyond that space, the ocean continues as it always has, unchanged, holding everything that has passed through it without returning what is needed to complete the story. Learning to live without an answer. After the search ends and the absence remains, there is one final stage that does not take place in the ocean. It takes place in the people who are left behind. Because while the ocean remains unchanged, those who expected a return must adjust to something else, not a confirmed loss, not a resolved event, but an open space where an answer should have been. And this space does not behave like other forms of absence. When something ends with certainty, there is a point that can be identified, a moment that separates before and after. But when something ends without confirmation, that separation is not clear. The transition does not fully occur. It remains incomplete. And because it is incomplete, it cannot be processed. In the same way, the mind continues to return to the same question. What happened? Not as a search for detail, but as a need for structure, a beginning, a middle, an end. Without that structure, the event does not settle. It continues to move, not forward into new information, but in cycles, returning to the last known point, revisiting what was already known, looking again at the same details that once suggested normality, and asking if something was missed. This process does not produce answers, but it continues because the absence has not been resolved. Over time, this changes, not because new information appears, but because the need for resolution adjusts. The question does not disappear, but it becomes quieter, less immediate, more distant. It remains present, but not active. In the same way, this is not acceptance in the sense of understanding. It is acceptance of limitation, the recognition that some answers will not be available. And that recognition does not arrive all at once. It forms gradually through repetition, through time, through the continued absence of new information, until eventually the expectation of an answer is replaced by something else, a different kind of awareness that the story will remain incomplete, and that incompleteness is part of what defines it. This does not remove the significance of what happened. It changes how it is held, not as something that can be fully explained, but as something that exists within limits, and those limits become part of the understanding. In some cases, this leads to further attempts, new searches, new technologies, new efforts to reach what could not be reached before. And sometimes these efforts succeed. A wreck is found, a location is confirmed, a sequence can be reconstructed. But in many cases, this does not occur. The conditions remain the same. The ocean remains unchanged, and the absence remains as it was. So the process of living with that absence continues, not actively, but as a background condition, a quiet awareness that something is missing in a way that cannot be resolved. This awareness does not require constant attention. It does not interrupt daily life, but it does not disappear. It exists alongside everything else, and occasionally it returns to the surface, not as a new question, but as a reminder of an unanswered one. This is the final form of these stories, not in the ocean, but in memory, in the way they are carried over time, without resolution, without conclusion, but not without meaning, because even without answers, they indicate something, not about a specific event, but about a limit, a boundary between what can be known and what cannot. And in recognizing that boundary, there is a form of understanding, not complete, but sufficient enough to allow the story to remain as it is, not finished, but not unresolved. In the same way it once was, it becomes something else, a presence without detail, a question without urgency, a part of the world that exists without needing to be fully explained. And in that state, the story remains, not because it is active, but because it has not been closed. And some stories are not meant to be closed. They are meant to exist within that space, between knowing and not knowing, between presence and absence. And in that space, they remain quiet, unresolved, but still part of the world that continues around them, even as the ocean moves on unchanged. What these stories quietly change. Not all stories change the way we see the world. Most stories fit into something we already understand. They begin, they develop, they end, and within that structure, they confirm what we expect, that events follow sequence. That causes lead to results, that what happens can be explained, but some stories do something else. They do not confirm. They shift, not dramatically, not in a way that is immediately clear, but quietly. Over time, stories of ships that are never found belong to that kind because they do not follow the expected pattern. They begin in a familiar way, a departure, a direction, a purpose. Everything aligns with what has happened before, but then they do not continue in the same structure. They stop, not with an ending, but with an absence of one. And that absence creates a different experience, not confusion, but a shift in expectation. Because once we encounter a story that does not resolve, it becomes more difficult to assume that all stories will. This does not create fear. It creates awareness, a recognition that not everything moves toward explanation, that some events exist without being fully understood. And this recognition changes something subtle, the way we interpret normality. Because before, normal conditions suggested predictable outcomes. A ship on course would arrive. A journey in progress would continue. There was a connection between appearance and result. But these stories introduce a difference. That appearance does not guarantee outcome. That continuity does not ensure completion. And that something can move from presence to absence without a visible transition between the two. This does not replace the original understanding, Most journeys still follow expected paths. Most systems still function as intended, but the certainty within that understanding becomes less absolute, not removed, but softened. And in that softening, there is a different kind of awareness, one that does not rely entirely on visible structure, one that recognizes the possibility of limits, not as something to focus on constantly, but as something that exists quietly in the background. This awareness does not change behavior in a direct way. It does not alter how ships are built, how routes are planned, but it changes how these systems are understood, not as complete, but as effective within certain boundaries. And beyond those boundaries, something else begins. Not disorder, but uncertainty. And uncertainty is not something that can be fully removed. It can be reduced, managed, but not eliminated, because it is part of the environment in which these journeys take place. The ocean is not incomplete. It does not lack information in the way we imagine. It simply does not provide all the information we seek. And once that is recognized, the expectation of complete understanding begins to change, not dramatically, but enough to shift perspective, to allow for the idea that some outcomes will remain open. And that openness is not a failure. It is a condition, a natural result of operating within a space that extends beyond what can be fully observed. This is what these stories quietly introduce, not mystery as something to solve, but limitation as something to understand. And in that understanding, there is a form of balance between what can be known and what cannot, between structure and uncertainty, between presence and absence. This balance does not resolve the stories themselves. The ships are still not found. The journeys are still incomplete, but it changes how they are held, not as problems waiting for solutions, but as examples of a boundary. And boundaries do not always need to be crossed. Sometimes they are simply recognized, and once recognized, they become part of the larger structure of understanding, not central, but present. A quiet addition to the way the world is seen, and over time, that addition becomes natural. It does not stand out. It does not demand attention, but it remains, influencing how new information is interpreted, how expectations are formed, how absence is understood. And in that influence, these stories continue, not through new events, but through perspective, through the way they reshape what seems certain, not by removing certainty, but by showing that it is not absolute. And that is what they change. Not the ocean, not the ships, but the way we understand what it means for something to continue and what it means for something to simply stop without explanation. And in that understanding, the story remains not unfinished, but open in a way that does not require a final answer to exist. Where the journey fades. At the end of every journey, there is usually a place, a harbor, a shoreline, a point where movement becomes stillness, where what has been carried arrives, where what has been experienced can be set down. But not all journeys reach that place. Some do not end with arrival. They do not close in a way that can be clearly marked. They do not return to something that can be seen again. Instead, they fade, not suddenly, but gradually, from presence into absence, from movement into stillness that cannot be observed. out, and when they fade in this way, there is no single moment that defines their end, no final step that completes the path, only a point where the journey can no longer be followed. And beyond that point, there is nothing to trace, nothing to confirm, only the awareness that something has moved out of reach. The ocean does not change when this happens. It does not acknowledge what has been lost. It does not reflect the absence in any visible way. It continues as it always has. Surface moving, horizon steady, depths unchanged. From above, there is no difference between a place where a journey ended and a place where no journey ever passed. And this is where the story settles, not in a location, but in a condition, a state in which something once existed and no longer does, in a way that can be recovered. This state does not require constant attention. It does not interrupt what continues around it, but it remains quietly as part of the world that includes both what is known and what is not. Over time, the details become less immediate. The names, the dates, the specific routes that were followed, they remain recorded, but they move further from the present. What stays is not the sequence. It is the space left behind, a space that does not change because it is not defined by time. It is defined by absence, and absence does not evolve in the same way as presence. It remains as it was when it first appeared, unresolved, but no longer active. In the same way, it becomes part of the background, not forgotten, but not immediate. And in that background, the journey takes on a different form, not as something that continues to move, but as something that continues to exist without progression, without conclusion. This is not an incomplete ending. It is a different kind of ending, one that does not close, but does not need to be closed, because not all journeys are meant to return. Some exist only in their movement, and when that movement can no longer be followed, the journey does not disappear. It changes from something that can be traced into something that can only be remembered. And in that transition, there is no loss of meaning, only a change in how that meaning is held, not through detail, but through awareness that something once moved across a space that remains unchanged, and that within that space there are moments that no longer exist in a visible form, but are not gone. They are simply beyond reach, and beyond that reach, the ocean continues, unmarked, without distinction between what has passed and what remains, holding everything without revealing everything. And in that quiet continuation, the journey fades not into nothing, but into something that no longer needs to be followed to exist. And that is where this story rests, not at an ending, but at a distance where the line between what is known and what is not becomes still, and the ocean, as always, remains calm, endless, unchanged.